Hi, everybody. It's meteorologist Joe Cioffi here with my colleague, meteorologist Joe Rayo, as YouTube getting their version of the Joe and Joe show tonight.
Yes, indeed.
Did you have a good weekend?
Spent most of it outside, mowing and mulching and doing the usual stuff. Because I didn't have a chance over the past week, and the grass was so long, I had all these little white flowers, I think they're called clover, popping up every which way.
Oh, yeah, I got that too.
And so, it had to be done, and certainly, no complaints weather-wise, especially on Saturday. We were talking about how letter perfect it was on Saturday.
I mentioned to you, and you agreed with me, one of the really remarkable things for me was when I woke up Saturday morning and looked out my window, it struck me just how clear the air was, devoid of any humidity with those dew points in the 40s, and how deep blue the sky was as well. And this was some dry air mass, because here we are at this point, and we're still in pretty good shape here in our area, covering basically eastern Pennsylvania to southern New England and everybody in between. The humidity's still pretty reasonable.
It's reasonable, and we didn't have overly hot temperatures today, but yet the Environmental Protection Agency, or whoever is in charge of taking note of such things, did put us under an air quality alert for today into tomorrow. I'm not really sure why. It didn't seem like we had all that much in terms of pollutants in the air, but anyway.
I don't know what their standards are, with regards to measuring that stuff.
How many of you out there remember back in the 70s, the Daily News had on their weather page, they had a little thing with pictures of the skyscraper, and they called it air decks.
Right.
And it seemed to me like back then, the air decks was always somewhere verging on unhealthy. It was very rare when we had satisfactory.
But that was a different world there, and there was a lot of industry here, a lot of factories and smog, and that's all gone. But I don't know. I also remember driving. It was either Thursday or Friday when I was driving over the Throgs Neck Bridge, in the midst of that really hot air mass, and just thinking. Just being able to see the city, really, there wasn't that much haze at all. It was great visibility. We're going to talk about, everybody's waiting on what we have to say about Tropical Storm Chris, soon to be Hurricane Chris. So we can, we'll bring that up front and center here.
We may have perhaps, maybe not. I was just saying, intermediate advisory this evening. It indicates that Chris is now a hurricane, because he's only 4 miles shy of hurricane force, to 70 miles per hour at the last advisory from the Hurricane Center, and most certainly he will be a hurricane by either later tonight or first thing in the morning tomorrow.
Two things, Joe, that stand out on the satellite loop, in my view. Well, Chris is the obvious one, and there appears to be an eye that's coming and going. So it really does. It is beginning to look like it's almost a minimal hurricane status. The Air Force plane found winds, close to hurricane force at flight level. You've got the upper low. There's that spinning that you see northeast of Chris.
Right.
That is a cold upper air low, and of course you've got all this dry air. And if you go up north of the Canadian border, there's the next cold front. So Chris basically at the moment trapped in a sort of no man's land of no flow. It's not moving. The impacts are going to be mainly to the beaches the next several days. A lot of folks will be headed to the shore, rip currents, waves, and that kind of thing. But this might get close to Nova Scotia at some point on Thursday, and we'll show you the Hurricane Center forecast, show everybody that in a second. And then eventually close enough to Newfoundland.
Right. Two lovely areas, by the way. I've been there. I've been to Nova Scotia a couple of times, and Newfoundland, just absolutely wonderful. By the way, if you ever have a chance to see that play that's running on Broadway, come away with me. The play is about all the planes that were diverted to Gander, Newfoundland, in the aftermath of 9/11.
Yes.
And the people in that play, the people. If you ever go there, it's like another world. They're so friendly, and the last thing that you want to see now is a major storm come rolling through that part of the world. But it looks like maybe by Thursday or Friday, Chris will be up there, and a rather potent storm by then. Probably.
Yeah, it does look like this is going to be. It might evolve into a extratropical cyclone when it gets up north of 45 degrees north or so. But it's still going to have some punch, I think, when it goes by.
Absolutely. It's rather interesting to see how the models are developing this storm so rapidly over the next 24 to 48 hours, how the pressure gradient is tightening up some. And as you just alluded to, Joe, that's going to have a say in the weather for anyone who plans to go either to the Jersey Shore or the South Shore of Long Island, because there will be some undertow, some rip currents, and some rather rough seas generated by Chris.
Right. Totally agreed. Since water temperatures have been the focus of conversation for the last couple of weeks with the various people that get involved in the long range and forecast with regards to hurricane season, and they've been slowly cutting back on their numbers. But I just wanted to kind of illustrate where the ocean water temperatures are at this point. And if you want to use a guide, 26 degrees Celsius, which equates to about 78, 79 degrees, is probably the threshold where you could support tropical storm. And you start to get into 28C, and now 27, 28C. You start to support hurricane strength. The thing that stands out to me is the fact that you've got a lot of the tropical Atlantic still. Once you go west of east of 50 degrees west, below threshold to support tropical storm development, and that kind of makes the fact that Beryl was able to form even more remarkable, because the water wasn't that warm there.
Right.
But the other thing is, in the subtropics, you've got 28 Celsius water that has actually nosed its way up to off the Delaware coast.
Wow.
So you've got a fairly large pool of very warm water in the southwest Atlantic that is certainly supportive of tropical storm formation, as is the Gulf of Mexico, the Caribbean, and then as you go to just east of the islands. This is probably a little smaller than what it usually is this time of year, and I even have the anomalies on a loop, which is pretty interesting. Joe, the blue area is all below average water temperatures, and you see I think, I don't know, I don't know what you think about this. I think there seems to be, I'm not entirely sold on the idea that the hurricane season is going to be suddenly less active than normal, solely based on the fact that the water temperatures are colder. They're below average, but they're not that far below average. They're running about 0 to 1 degree below average. That is very easily corrected.
I think I saw something where somebody was comparing this season in terms of the water temperature to 1985. And of course, those of you who are really into this sort of thing remember 1985 was the year we had Hurricane Gloria, which developed not way out over the Cape Verdes, but actually down on this side of the pond, and eventually made its way northward and cut across central Long Island. I'm not saying that's going to happen this year, but they're using that. I forget now who commented on this, making the suggestion that, there are going to be more of these homegrown tropical systems this year because of the anomalously cool water out toward Africa, as opposed to, the standard or the other years.
By the way, one of the big interesting things that's happened, this loop goes from June 25th to yesterday. If you look from Virginia to southern New England, during that heat wave period with the southeast wind, it goes way above average. Right. And then over the last couple of days, as we've gotten this dry push and this cooler push, with a little bit of upwelling, now we've actually developed a few cool pockets again. So it does show you certainly there is volatility here, depending on what the synoptic situation is. Where if you have a big storm someplace, or if you've got a lot of wind going on, where you can get upwelling and the water temperatures can cool and change. They tend to not change very much, but you do get these volatile shocks one way or the other. It's just kind of interesting that the water just offshore still remains pretty warm, and you've got that large area of below average, but like in the tropical Atlantic, part of the Atlantic south of 20. But I don't know. I wonder whether that may wind up changing over time. We'll see.
And that's a good reason also why the waters are so very warm. Probably is the reason why Chris is going to become so very strong. He may gain like 10 or 20 mile per hour sustained winds near the center over the next 24 hours or so. And then as it rockets north and eastward, out ahead of that next frontal zone that moves on in tomorrow night and Wednesday, up toward Nova Scotia and Newfoundland, the waters up there are noticeably chillier, and that'll pretty much strip Chris of his tropical characteristics and become extratropical. But still, again, a very formidable storm.
Formidable.
by
I was like
later in the week.
formidable.
Yes.
This is off the Hurricane Center's website. This is actually the interactive forecast that they have, and it's available to all. Just go to nhc.noaa.gov. I'm bringing it up, and you can add the variables that you like. So I've got track and wind watches and warnings and storm surge watches and warnings, which there are none at the moment. I've put on in the colors, Joe, the 50-knot winds. You can see all the strong winds are going to be well offshore, and you can also add the past track, which I just did. And this is where, in terms of where it's forecast to be, I'll get a little closer. And at least from the standpoint of the East Coast, it passes well offshore. This is all, again, rip currents, waves at the beaches this week. But here's where we are when we come to, for Nova Scotia and Newfoundland, 8 a.m. Thursday, offshore, not by a whole lot. I mean, but it is offshore, and it gets very close to St. John's, Newfoundland, Friday morning, probably as an extratropical cyclone.
Right. And for those who are watching, who don't understand, well, I mean, it's so far offshore, so how could it have a say in our local conditions on the water? You have to understand that these hurricanes and strong tropical storm systems, they're kind of like, if you will, giant egg beaters or giant agitators in the ocean. And so you get this passing even a few hundred miles away from you. The fact that the waters are getting churned up by this particular weather system actually propagates or spreads out over toward the shorelines, and that's why Wednesday and Thursday, even though, again, the storm really doesn't come even close enough to provide us with significant cloud cover, it still will be a player if you're going to the beaches. Maybe some of the red flags will be up along the Jersey or
they were already
Long
up
Island
today. One of the things we should mention, because we do have, Joe, we do have folks that watch from Newfoundland and Nova Scotia. Please, make sure you check with regards to whatever questions you have with this. There's nothing imminent at this point, but certainly you have to be paying some attention. Please check with your local, the Canadian, your Canadian National Weather Service, Environment Canada, for latest information on this, and if you have any questions, that's where they go, to them and to your local officials.
I believe, I may be wrong, but I believe that the National Hurricane Center, in situations like what we're looking at in the next few days, works hand in hand with Environment Canada's weather office up at Halifax in Nova Scotia.
Right, they talk.
And of course, Halifax puts out specific warnings and advisories for the ocean shore areas of Nova Scotia, and also for up in Newfoundland as well.
I got the upper air because this way we can we can kind of see why is this not going to be impacting the East Coast. So right off the Carolinas is the upper air representation of Chris. That upper low that we showed you on the satellite loop is to the northeast. The main jet is running right across Canada, north of the border, and you've got this big upper high that's out overhead into the west. But as we move through, let me make sure I got the time frame correct here. So this is right now for Sunday, and now we're at Monday. There it is, kind of trapped in no man's land. And now what happens is, Joe, that northern jet comes down, it pushes a cold front through here late tomorrow, and it picks it up and then just basically punts it to the northeast.
Right.
And it gets fairly close to Nova Scotia. And by the way, one of the things we should mention too, by the way, is as it makes the transition over to an extratropical cyclone, you're going to shift the wind, the rain area to the west side.
Right.
So it does change the
character
and the structure, where it starts to behave more like it is going to be a non-tropical system. So it would behave in a sense the way a winter gale would behave, as opposed to a purely tropical system. But we can at least get close up to southeastern Canada here. Where is it? Southeast. It's here somewhere. Let me get the right geography. There we go. But here it is on the at least from the GFS. It's fairly far enough offshore. It's just kind of a graze, except for eastern areas of Nova Scotia. But it does move it pretty much right over Newfoundland during Friday morning, starting to weaken here a bit. But it still will have some punch as it goes through with some wind and rain.
Right.
That's what it is. That's what it seems to me, anyway.
St. John's, and it looks like there's also a very small town, which I've been to, Bonavista, the cruise ship that I was on when I visited Newfoundland. This was back in 1999. And to give you some idea of how friendly these people are, literally, like, almost the entire town comes out to greet the cruise ships. These are people who they have no clue. In fact, the day that I was on the ship and got off, I meet this one woman, shake my hand. How happy to see you! And who are you? I said, oh, I am the mayor.
That's really that's very cool.
So
actually.
it is, and again, I hope that this is not as bad as it looks, because it looks like Chris is going to be coming right up in that area come the end of the week.
Right. So here's the full U.S. view, just to with this cold front coming through. At least for tomorrow, maybe a shower or thunderstorm with that tomorrow evening. And then looks like another push of dry air or drier air. It won't be quite as dry as what we saw this weekend, but it'll be dry enough. And with with Chris offshore at this point, a hurricane, it kind of reinforces the drier air that's going to be overhead. So the weather actually for the second half of the week, to me, at least Wednesday and Thursday for sure, look pretty good. To me, it's just kind of got a very typical July look to it.
Right.
There's nothing, we don't see anything unusually hot. We don't see anything unusually cool. Just kind of going forward until further notice. Let's put it that way.
What we just went through was somewhat anomalous. I mean, it's very unusual. I mean, it's not unusual to see heat and humidity in July, obviously, but it is kind of unusual when you get it as long as what we had. We had like 8 days of very humid and hot temperatures. But this is what I like. I mean, I could put up with heat and humidity for a day or two, but it looks like, again, we're back in that fast flow where everything changes fairly quickly. So if you don't like the weather, just wait a little while.
Well, yeah. The long range, to me, it still remains the same. It looks like we've gotten back to at least where we're getting these systems in the northern part of the jet stream dropping into the east. So that brings cold fronts through every three or 4 days or so. Maybe over the weekend, maybe starting on Friday over the weekend and early next week, a little bit of a ridge there. But eventually it looks like the jet not only comes back and the trough in the east comes back and takes hold in the longer term. So, if this is right, to me, this suggests two things to me. I mentioned, one is the fact that you won't be able to string together more than a couple of hot days back to back.
Right.
Okay. So you can forget about 8, 9, 10 days in a row, 10-day heat waves in a situation like this. The other thing that I want to just bring up, and this is all in the theoretical, if we keep seeing this trough in the east in the long range, if it gets into like this in the month of August, we're going to start seeing some pretty interesting cool shots coming down,
right.
For one thing. And the other thing is, with a trough in the east, you have to keep an open mind and an open eye to the possibility that if you couple a trough in the east with a tropical system at the same time, and then depending on where that trough is, it could be problematic.
Right.
We'll just have to wait and see. But it's something that I think we certainly should be paying attention to.
I seem to remember in the 70s now that there were more than a few occasions in August where we had some pretty interesting shots of chilly air. I remember one particular case. I was at the Some of our viewers may know of this place. It's called the Mohonk Mountain House up in New Paltz in the Catskills of New York. And it was mid-August of 1979. And it was amazingly, I mean, there were gusty winds, temperatures just barely making up to 70. And the night times were dropping down well into the 40s, maybe even touching the 30s. I'm talking about August now.
Yeah.
And I remember earlier...
We haven't
in the
seen too much of that in the last few years, but
Right.
maybe this year it'll be different.
Earlier in the I think it was 73 or 74, I was up in Vermont again. Temperatures well down in the 40s in mid-August. I was camping, for goodness sake. And if it happens again this summer, it's not impossible. It hasn't happened, as you just mentioned, Joe, in quite some time, but we have seen that in other years where all of a sudden it's like a preview of late September, but you get that in August. And let me say this: if we had a kind of day like we had on Saturday, dew point temperatures in the 40s.
Yeah.
How many times has that happened in July?
It's rare. I can't remember the last time.
That may be a forebearer or a sign of what may be coming our way in August in terms of cooler and drier and unseasonably push of dry northerly winds for August.
Mirtha Gunter, who watches us from Western North Carolina, says, could the colder water be because of the depth of the water? The deeper, the colder. That was a question I was discussing with Bill Goodman from the Weather Service. We were talking about the fact that one of the questions is, with the sea surface temperatures, that goes down to a certain depth. If I remember correctly, about
Right.
6 feet. The question is, the water underneath in the tropical Atlantic. Sometimes you can get these patches where the water underneath is pretty warm. That the warm layer goes pretty
Right.
far down.
Right.
And that's important. Whereas up our way, I would imagine that the warm layer is actually fairly shallow.
Right.
That you don't, you start getting into deeper water and you start measuring, you're going to find bigger large temperature differences.
And a nice little gusty wind will bring some of that chillier air upwelling and bring a sudden change from very warm water to very cool water.
Right, but the depth of how warm that water is very important in trying to determine how much potential strength you have or potential energy you may have with the development of a tropical system. Let's see, Anthony, or you never could possibly make me mad. So I'm not mad at you. If tropical system Chris would wander out another 100 miles, the fetch could straighten out and bring big waves. Cullen, it's moving at it's going to be moving at a pretty good clip. So I think you may not have a whole lot of time for, it'll get rough and rocky for a while, but
Right.
I don't know about, something, in terms of extreme, that I don't see, because the thing is going to be running up like a rocket ship, eventually moving up to the northeast.
I like the term you use, punt. Indeed,
Yeah.
it's gonna,
It punts, absolutely.
As soon as the that front comes on down and the upper level winds align, boom, out goes Chris. And I don't know about you, I've been keeping track. I could remember the earliest Chris in my memory. I can remember a Chris back in the early '80s. This name has recycled a number of times. Every 6 years.
Eric Spencer, have you taken a look at Typhoon Maria and how much of an anomaly was last year's major hurricane occurrence? I actually was looking. Let me bring. Hang on one second, because we could go to Tropical Tidbits and actually bring up Maria on the storms page there. Top winds 115 knots. I'll bring up a loop, and we can show everybody here. I'm not haven't had a chance to look at the geography of where it's approaching, but let's...
Now this, for those people who hear the name Maria, we're not showing you Maria from last summer. This is actually a typhoon in the western Pacific Ocean.
Correct. But a well-defined eye.
Right.
I got to look at the map to see exactly...
Would that be the Philippines, perhaps?
It might be. Let's take a look. Hang on one second. Hang on. See how I can do this. I'll leave the
Is there a way you can pull the camera out?
yeah, hang on. We're gonna.
Man, look at that eye. That's
very impressive.
That's
So
your
115
classic.
knots. It's a category 4.
And this is a classic tropical cyclone. And again, for those who live in eastern sections of Asia, they refer to this as a typhoon, but for all intents and purposes, it's the exact same kind of system that we see here in the Atlantic and the Caribbean, and what we call a hurricane.
Let's see. I'm going to bring up one of the maps here.
And what the Australians refer to as a willy willy.
This is actually, Joe, that is Taiwan.
Oh, okay.
The island of Taiwan, I believe. And then the coastline that to the north and west of that was the coast of China.
Okay.
So that's where it is headed as a Category 3 hurricane. Here's the, yeah. So that was Taiwan. It looks like near or just north of Taiwan, but very, very close. Very interesting to see that.
I'd be interested to know, just throwing this out, and of course I don't know if maybe you know, but probably not. I'd like to know whether this is unusual for them to see such a well-structured and powerful storm this early in their hurricane season.
This is a question for Mr. Levi Cowan of Tropical Tidbits, which you were trying to get him on. You did best. Levi, if you're watching this, check your email, okay? Because we'd love to have you Skype in so you could maybe, you could certainly answer a lot of questions. And with your, expertise, I really have a few questions regarding Beryl. And because I kind of thought it was pretty remarkable that it formed the way it did. Johnny Quest lives in Western Virginia. Just to kind of change topics here for a second, but Johnny Quest lives in Western Virginia. 45 inches of rain that they've had for the last 3 months. So they basically have gotten almost a year's worth of rain in 3 months' time, because they were sitting in that zone. That frontal boundary kept setting up right along or just north of 35 degrees north, and he got hammered. At least you're enjoying the dry air this time around. Is Tropical Storm Beryl going out to sea? Beryl right now is gone. And the Hurricane Center is thinking that there's a possibility that it could regenerate late this week near the Bahamas. I'll wait to see what happens. Let's get Chris out of the way, and we'll see whether Beryl's going to be able to do anything. But I think the pattern in the east would kind of still favor that staying offshore, even if it were to regenerate. At least from what we see right now.
Don't think that in the immediate future we would have any worries from any kind of offshore tropical system, be it Chris or maybe a resurgence of Beryl, if indeed it does decide to regenerate. Iron
Mine 10, cool pools of air to the northeast or over the northeast could develop thunderstorms with hail, ? Upper atmosphere is much colder. Well, if you could get, if you get the Canadian jet to come far enough south this time of year, then I certainly think that could be, it would certainly increase the possibility of severe weather in the northeast.
Yeah. But
that's a big if, and we got to get that to happen first.
And I know what your answer is, because we were discussing this off air. Tomorrow, with that weather front coming through, the possibility exists for maybe an isolated local thunderstorm, but they're going to be few and far between with this next weather front that's coming in later tomorrow night, right? Or we're not talking about anything super organized.
No, the dew points are low. Relatively speaking, it's not like last week with dew points in the mid 70s.
No.
They're only going to get to the low 60s tomorrow, which compared to where we've been is tropical, relatively speaking. Weather Enlow 78. Joe Bastardi is very worried about a big East Coast hurricane in August or September, and he's worrying you for Norfolk. Okay, you and I had this conversation the other day, and remember what I told you, okay? So we'll just leave it at that, but you don't worry about stuff until there's something to worry about. So there's no point in, I could say that every year. That's a statement. I don't want to get into. Mr. Bastardi does what he does, and I'm just going to kind of leave it at that. I don't want to say one way or the other what my opinion is regarding that. But look, the bottom line is every year, August and September, I would worry about a hurricane coming up the East Coast, because that's when they would happen, if they're going to happen. Absolutely. Do I lose sleep over it? No. Will I lose sleep over it? No. GD Frail 2017. If we are getting Category 4s in the ocean in the Pacific, I can imagine what September will be like. Well,
that's what I'm saying. I mean,
yeah.
is it has the Pacific warmed up to it? Well, of course, we've just talked about it a little while ago with the Atlantic Ocean and how warm
I looked at the Pacific anomalies. At least I didn't pay close attention. I'll go back when we're done. I'll take a look, but. The Pacific anomalies, from what I remember, I mean, there are a few spots a little above normal. It's not crazy above normal like it was in 2016 with the El Nino, where there were areas that were 5 degrees Celsius above normal, right. And we were getting Hurricane Patricia that went into Mexico with 205 mile an hour sustained winds and a pressure of some ridiculous low pressure, whatever it was.
What I'm saying is, how often do we usually see in the Pacific now?
Yeah, you mean talking about the West Pacific,
right? The Category 3 or a Category 4
this early
in the season, and again, Levi would probably know.
They get tropical cyclones on that. Almost not every year, but they have occurred in just about every month. It's kind of an ongoing season for them. Yeah, we got to talk to Levi about this.
And just to backtrack to that question about, you were talking about Mr. Bastardi, there are two ways you can look at this. As we mentioned at the earlier part of the show, the fact that the temperature anomalies are so very warm adjacent to or near the east coast of the United States, we might very well see a, quote, homegrown tropical cyclone or a series of those tropical cyclones, which may have a say in moving in our general direction. On the other hand, however, as Joe was pointing out, if that trough develops in the over central North America and starts bringing down unseasonably cool weather down in our direction, a lot of those potential problematic storms may end up being deflected out away from the coastline. On the other hand, if you get the trough aligned just the right way, a little bit closer to the coast, it could very well bring... but why...
It opens the door, but it's not something you could sit here now and worry about it. These are conversations we could have every year.
It's something for the tabloids,
right? Scott Briller, Hi Joe ×2. He says, "Is there any chance we don't see another long heat wave this summer, like say 4 days in a row?" I'll go back to what I said as far as where we are. Okay, if we keep seeing the trough in the east to varying strengths and no ridge in the east, it's going to be very hard to string together more than a couple of hot days back to back. Could it get, when I say hot, by the way, I'm talking about 91 or higher, okay, or 90 or higher. But are we going to have a bunch of days with temperatures in the mid to upper 80s? Yeah, that would be almost average for this time of year. So that wouldn't be unusual. But you'll be hard to string together 10 or 11 days in a row if you're going to keep having a trough and a cold front coming through every 3 or 4 days.
Please, don't even... From your lips to God's ears, I think.
Also, Doug Johnson, what is your prediction for NO, for Northern Virginia? I assume that you mean Northern Virginia this hurricane season, and why do you always get so lucky? Well, Virginia, especially Chesapeake Bay, is in one of those kind of odd spots because areas to the south, like the North Carolina, South Carolina coastline, they get hit with far more frequency. And then areas, I would say, Long Island and into southern New England over the years probably get impact from more hurricanes direct hits. But it's hard to drive a storm in the direction where it would come northwestward. It has happened, but going into Chesapeake Bay and Delaware Bay,
right.
You're in kind of a funny spot where you're actually more likely to get impacted by something that goes into North Carolina and tracks up to your west rather than something that tracks from offshore and comes in from the southeast.
Right.
Very interesting. Let's see. Johnny Quest. Dio and Ann Kumar, if you missed the whole live stream, you could always watch it back from the beginning when it loads. It's always there in the library. Let's see. Johnny Quest, will all the wildfires in the west cause more rain because of the smoke particles in the air?
They've had a tremendous number of acreage that has been burned. That seems to happen every year now. I don't know. It seems like a regular thing. Come July and August, the western United States. Some years it's concentrated more, like let's say Arizona, New Mexico. Other years it's concentrated more in Wyoming. It seems like every year there is a large amount of forest fire activity that breaks out. And there really doesn't seem anything.
Does it get more attention? You wonder, Joe, because when you and I were younger, stories like this would be barely blurbs in a newspaper. You would never know that they were happening. And I just ask, without looking at numbers, haven't those fires have gone on in the West all along,
right?
And it's part of the regeneration process. You've had a lot of infrastructure built in areas where wildfires have occurred before, so you have to that begs the question: should you build a house, where there's been a natural occurrence of wildfires over the years? And I don't know whether the number of wildfires has increased relative to where we were, say, 20 years ago or 30 years ago. Maybe they haven't. Maybe they've always happened, but we never heard about it. It's not usually an area that you and I look at unless it's in the news.
Every once in a great while we have reports of forest fire activity, let's say in West Virginia or Virginia, someplace where there's been a lot of activity, and then the smoke actually makes its way up into the tri-state area, and you can actually smell the activity.
Yes.
And sometimes we get so much smoke, the sun looks like a red ball in the sky.
Yeah, Johnny Quest says the reason I ask is because the water vapor needs a grain or a particle of dust to stick to make a raindrop. I mean, I guess it's all part of the equation, one way or another. Whether it adds to it or not, I don't know. I think is for somebody with a higher pay grade to answer. GD Frail 2017, who I believe now has tipped his or her hand as watching us from Nova Scotia or Newfoundland. I'd like to know which one. Says Chris will be the first tropical system that he or she has experienced, and wants to know have either you or I have been in a tropical storm or hurricane before? And the answer is yes.
Yeah, we had the ones that I could remember. I don't remember. I remember a lot of things from when I was very young. I just simply cannot remember Donna in 1960.
That's a little.
I was a little young. I was 4 years old.
I was only one.
But Hurricane Beryl in 1976. There was also Doria, which was a tropical storm that came right into the tri-state area and went right up like the Taconic State Parkway. It was on a Friday night, Saturday morning back in 1971.
I kind of remember that a little bit. I remember Belle very well.
Belle was, and Gloria, of course.
Gloria.
Bob.
A few others peppered along the way. You know what? One I remembered was Hurricane David, because David was one of the
two of them, David and Frederick.
But David was the first Category 4 hurricane, I believe, in a long, long time, and the first Cape Verde system in a long time, and it came up the coast, inland of the coast, but east of the Appalachians, and there was a little extra tropical stuff going on. And we had, for about 6 or 7 hours, we had gusts of 60 or 70 miles an hour.
Right.
It was crazy.
And tornado watches.
Right, and then it was done. So I remember that. I remember about Frederick, but Frederick was similar, but it was further to the left.
Right.
So it didn't have the same impact here.
The remnants of Hugo passed way to the west. He figured, well, this is not going to... And I'll tell you, it blew my... this is when I was living on Long Island, Levittown. The door flew open. I mean, the screen door... The winds were tremendous, very strong and gusty for a storm that was so far to the west of us and inland.
Now, I remember when I worked in New Orleans, Elena, which I believe was in 85. But what was remarkable about that was a Category 3 hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico, and moved into the northern Gulf, and then turned sharply west, and was headed right into Lake Pontchartrain, which is one of the worst ways that you could have a storm come into New Orleans, because it would just basically pour the whole Gulf of Mexico into Lake Pontchartrain, and it would flood the whole surrounding area. Well, I lived literally, I could walk to the shores of Lake Pontchartrain, in Kenner, which is north of New Orleans,
Right.
and the eye, Elena began to weaken as it moved inland, and it was so small that the eye actually passed. I was inside the eye wall there, 10 miles from where I lived, and the strongest wind that I had was 15 miles an hour, and that was in a gust.
Isn't that amazing?
It was amazing, and so that was one that I remembered, and then of course I remember.
Remember Agnes?
Agnes, I remember in 72. There was a lot of rain.
Yeah.
And what was of course, the Irene, Sandy. Those are obvious. But there have been a few peppered along the way.
Irene, I'll never forget Irene in the sense that at the time I did not have a weather station set up in my backyard. So my wife, and we didn't even have a rain gauge. So my wife took out this big pitcher jug that we used to make iced tea or lemonade, and she just stuck it outside. And she calls me up. I was covering storm at the TV station I was working at, and she says, "You're not going to believe this. The water is overflowing in the jug," which meant that there was like 12 inches of rain.
Well, Johnny Quest, Hurricane Camille, he's in the Blue Ridge Mountains, in Western Virginia. And you're right. There were areas that got 30 inches of rain in a handful of hours. The flooding was incredible. And Camille, of course, coming in on the Mississippi Gulf Coast with one of the lowest pressures ever recorded, 905 millibars on a landfalling hurricane.
And who was the person who started this conversation in Nova Scotia?
Yes.
He may
G.D. Frail, 2017.
I wonder if he remembers Juan. Juan was a major tropical system. I don't remember exactly what year it was in Nova Scotia. And then the very next winter following that, they had a tremendous snowstorm that hit Nova Scotia. And the newspapers and the various media people in Nova Scotia were referring to the snowstorm as White Juan. Because it was
White Juan, yes.
White Juan. It was like the equivalent of having a hurricane in the wintertime, so they referred to it as white. But Juan was probably the most potent tropical system that hit Nova Scotia, I would think, in the last, let's say, 20 years.
And there have been, by the way, along the way, especially when you start dealing with tropical systems, later in the season into October, some of them actually have produced in their transition over into extratropical cyclones. Have produced significant amounts of snow. Even Sandy, by the way, in the mountains of West Virginia. I forgot about that, but some of the areas that got a couple of feet of snow in some of the higher elevations in West Virginia because of that.
And then a week after that, a week after we got hit by Sandy, we had a snowstorm of some significance, and that hit, I think, the day after Election Day in 2012.
G.D. Frail says, "Should I try filming Chris if it goes over Newfoundland? If so, I might post it on YouTube." You know what? I will just tell you that when it comes to stuff like that, I can just remember with Sandy, wasn't something, and I look, and I'm an adult. I kind of look out there and I say, nah, I'm not doing that. So pay attention to what your local Canadian Met offices tell you regarding that sort of thing.
The Weather Channel here in the States, when they do the assignments during an impending hurricane, and they say to you, you're going to be the one who's going to be on the coast as the storm is passing by. I wonder how that person feels. I wonder if they could back out of that, or say, look, send somebody else. I don't want to.
You know what? If I was, one of the things I did before I was married and I worked in Corpus Christi, did a story that required me to go up in a chopper.
Right.
Okay. After that, though, I made it very clear I don't do that. I'm not doing anything that's going to put myself at risk. And frankly, now, if it was me, no, I'm not going to put. I've never been really asked to do that, but I've asked the same question. Where they stuck these poor reporters at some of the national networks standing outside, in Puerto Rico and Cuba, or wherever, while the eye wall is going by from a Category 5 hurricane.
Right.
I'm not doing that.
I could see your point. one thing before we shut. I don't know if we're going to go.
Yeah, we're gonna have to put an end to this.
I do want to, and you might want to look for this when you go home and tonight, and for everybody else. About a month ago, I did a report. We did a half-hour special here at FiOS One News on hot topics of the summer of 2017. And when I got around to me, I mentioned a couple of things. I mentioned the annual Perseid meteor shower, which is coming up in about a month, but I also mentioned Mars. And Mars is making its closest approach to the Earth in 15 years later this month. Well, I was out the other night, Joe. I just totally, it was like 11:30, 12 o'clock, looked over into the east-southeast, and went, wow, what the hell is that? Mars is absolutely huge now. It is a bright yellow-orange object. Almost looks like an airplane headlight, one of those warning headlights coming in. And this is going to become even more prominent in the coming days and weeks. So if you haven't had a chance, step outside around 11 o'clock or so tonight, look toward the east-southeast, and you are going to see the biggest orange-yellow star-like object. And it doesn't twinkle, but that is Mars. And
with the sky the way it is, it's just beautiful. That's perfect opportunity.
That's really what set it off, really. I think the clarity of the sky or whatever, but it is just so bright. And if you haven't had a chance to see it, or maybe you just stumbled across it, and maybe you call in your police precinct, say there's a UFO out there. It's not. It's Mars. It's very bright. It's going to get even brighter between now and the end of the month. And you might want to take a look at it tonight because it's mainly clear.
My buddy, I just want to say real high. I want to just say hi real fast to my friend Chris Alley, who's watching us, and from Lindenhurst, where Sandy had big impact, and he knows all too well with regards to what happened there along the South Shore. Always good to see you, Chris. We have got to go. So Joe and I will be back tonight on our Facebook, Joe and Joe Weather Show, which will be at roughly 9:15. So if you're on Facebook, do join. Otherwise, I'll probably upload the show onto the video library, and you can watch it here on YouTube. So thanks for jumping on tonight with me, Joe.
This was fun.
Yeah, it's great. They've always asked for you.
Oh well. Thank you.
All right, so Facebook tonight, 9:15, the Joe and Joe Show, and any important updates with regards to tropical systems, we'll let you know. And of course, remember, just as a reminder, anytime a tropical storm or hurricane or severe weather, whatever that threatening weather that puts life and property at risk, for any questions you have, weather.gov. For the Hurricane Center, it's nhc.noaa.gov. And, of course, your local officials. If you're watching from Canada, the Canadian Met Service.
Environment
Canada. That is where that's your go-to place to get the information you need. Have a great evening, folks. We'll see you tomorrow or later on Facebook.
See you then.